This hearing will come to order. We have two distinguished panels today to help us look more closely at developments in the Ukraine. We are pleased to have on our first panel the Assistant Secretaries from State, Treasury, and Defense to brief us on the situation on the ground, and in our second panel, two former national security advisors to provide insights into the broader geopolitical implications of Putin's actions in Ukraine. In the past week, Ukraine appears to have mobilized around its new president. Ukrainian armed forces have been actively reclosing their border with Russia and pushing back Russian separatists. At the same time, President Putin's instigation of this conflict continues to breed uncertainty as to whether a corner has in fact been turned. In my view, President Putin is entirely capable of trying to divide Ukraine one day, and then, when the international community applies pressure, withdraw from the scene long enough to avoid the international community's scrutiny while effectively continuing his aggression to achieve his intended goal. In June, I wrote to President Obama asking him to seriously consider implementing additional targeted sanctions as soon as possible to deter Putin from further destabilizing Ukraine. I fully appreciate the importance of acting in concert with our European allies to ensure that sanctions have their intended effect, but at the same time, we should not hesitate to act unilaterally to support an independent Ukraine and counter malign Russian interference where delay threatens these goals, our strategic objectives, or our national interests. In the long run, a stable and secure region will serve our national interests and enhance opportunities for U.S. and European businesses. In my view, unless Putin is confronted with strong disincentives, he will continue to ensure that the Ukrainian government will not be able to stabilize the situation and that he will position himself to fill the power vacuum when the government can't fill the needs of parts of the Ukrainian people. A question for our panelists today is what steps and measures must Putin take now to demonstrate his commitment to resolving the conflict, and at what point would you call his bluff and proceed with additional sanctions? We're pleased to have some distinguished panelists before the committee. We look forward to gaining a deeper insight to what's happening on the ground and the broader geopolitical ramifications of Russia's actions. With that, let me turn to Senator Corker, the ranking member, for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for calling the hearing. I welcome our witnesses on both panels. I think we've got an outstanding group of people here today that I know will be very informative. I know this is almost becoming a cliche, but, you know, Russia seems to be a master at escalating and de-escalating at the same time, acts of duplicity which keep the Western world off balance. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today at what phase they think we're in relative to Russia. I know that we have some people here that are very committed public servants that I respect, but I have to say sometimes I'm embarrassed for you as you constantly talk about sanctions, and yet, candidly, we never see them put in place. So I do hope you'll enlighten us today as to where we might be in that regard. Media outlets have talked about another round of sanctions that you're preparing. I hope that you'll illuminate those today and talk to us a little bit about, as the chairman mentioned, what needs to occur from Russia's standpoint to either cause those to be put in place or not put in place. But again, I really feel like the sanctions threats have been very hollow, candidly have some of the same characteristics of the red line we talked about in Syria, and I certainly hope that changes soon because, and getting to my final point, I worry that where we're going with Russia relative to Ukraine is what a national security advisor in Eastern Europe said to me recently, and that was he fears that our policy is taking us to a place where we're going to have a bitter peace with Russia, where in essence we sweep under the rug the actions that have taken place and continue to take place, the actions that have taken place in Crimea and continue to take place in eastern Ukraine, and we basically get back to business as usual, which, you know, looks like that's where we may be heading, which over time could lead to some more major consequences in Eastern Europe and the world. I hope that's not the policy that this administration is embarking on. I thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Corker. Our first panel today We welcome back Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, Daniel Glaser, who's the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Terrorist Financing, and Chollet, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Let me remind our panelists that your full statements will be included in the record. I'd ask you to try to summarize them in 5 minutes so we can enter into a dialogue. In the course of just receiving your testimony, Madam Secretary, I just skimmed through it, and I hope that you'll be ready to respond, if not in your statement, then when we get to Q&A, to this one line on the third page where it says, "We are ready to impose more costs, including targeted sector-specific sanctions, very soon if Russia does not decisively change course and break its ties with separatists." Seems like we've heard that very soon, so maybe you can quantify that for us. And with that, we recognize you.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Corker, and members of this committee, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you again today on the situation in Ukraine. As you said, longer statement will be submitted for the record. In previous testimony before this committee, I've outlined 4 pillars of U.S. policy: support for Ukraine as it tackles its urgent political, economic, and security challenges; diplomatic efforts to try to de-escalate the crisis; imposing further costs, including targeted sectoral sanctions on Russia and separatists who are fomenting violence and unrest in Ukraine; and number 4, reassurance of frontline NATO allies and friends like Georgia and Moldova. Today in my statement, I'll focus on the first 2 lines of effort. Assistant Secretary Chollet will talk about our security support for Ukraine and our allies, and Assistant Secretary Glaser will talk about sanctions policy, but of course, we will all answer your questions. Since I last appeared before you, voters from across Ukraine took to the polls on May 25th and elected President Poroshenko with 54.7% of the vote. Just weeks and days earlier, many doubted that the elections would even take place. It was the determination and courage of millions of Ukrainians to choose their own future that made free, fair elections possible, along with the support of the international community. But as you know, Ukraine's security remains under threat as fighting continues in eastern parts of the country, and Crimea remains under occupation. Against this backdrop, the United States is supporting Ukraine in this hour of its need. We've stepped up our security assistance, which Assistant Secretary Chollet will discuss. However, the more lasting antidote to separatism and outside interference over the medium term is for Ukraine to succeed as a democratic, free market state and to beat back the corruption, dependence, and external pressure that have thwarted Ukrainians' aspirations for decades. Since the onset of this crisis, with this Congress's support, we've provided Ukraine with a $1 billion loan guarantee specifically targeted to soften the impact of economic reforms on the country's most vulnerable. We're also providing approximately $196 million in other assistance to Ukraine this year. Of this, we've already authorized $75 million in support of economic reform, anti-corruption measures, nonpartisan electoral assistance, non-lethal security assistance, and humanitarian aid for Ukrainians internally displaced from Crimea and eastern Ukraine. We're now working with President Poroshenko, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, and their team to direct the remaining $59 million in 4 key areas. First, support for economic growth and reform. Second, countering corruption. Third, energy diversification and efficiency. And 4, constitutional reform and national unity. We'll be sending up a formal congressional notification very shortly, but let me just give you some highlights. In the area of economic reform and growth, we will complement World Bank and IMF programs by working to help strengthen the Ukrainian banking sector, making the business climate more competitive and attractive to investors, and helping Ukraine diversify its export markets. Our anti-corruption support will help support the government's new 3-year program and bolster its ability to deter, to detect, investigate, and prosecute corruption wherever it festers, and support civil society, the media, business, and government as they work together to root it out. In the energy area, we will help the government to restructure the sector and to deploy new technologies to increase energy yields and efficiency, and to assist Ukraine in developing national plans for sustainable use of natural resources. And finally, we will help the government implement the constitutional reform and broad decentralization of power at the local and regional level that has been central to President Poroshenko's peace plan and to rebuilding national unity. As we support Ukraine economically, as you know, we have also worked in lockstep with the Ukrainian government and our European allies and partners to try to de-escalate the tensions with Russia and with Russian-backed separatists through repeated rounds of diplomacy, which we've talked about here. In successive settings, we've supported the Ukrainian government's offers to address those concerns that are legitimate of Eastern Ukrainians and Russian speakers by political means, and to offer an off-ramp to separatists and to their Russian backers. These efforts have culminated most recently in President Poroshenko's broad-reaching peace plan, which he first presented in his inaugural address, which offers amnesty to separatists who lay down their arms, political dialogue, broad decentralization of power, in short, virtually all of the things that the separatists and their backers in Moscow have said that are needed. President Poroshenko, as you know, also initiated on June 27th a 10-day unilateral ceasefire to try to provide space for dialogue with separatists. But as you also know, this ceasefire was met with 10 days of violence, bloodshed, and separatist land grabs as Russia simultaneously allowed tanks, heavy artillery, and fighters to flow across the border. On June 27th, EU leaders again called on Russia to end all support for separatists, to control the border, to use its influence with separatists to return the 3 border checkpoints to Ukrainian authorities that they had taken, to release hostages, and to launch substantial negotiations on the peace plan. These are the same criteria that the U.S. is continuing to use to measure Russia's willingness to de-escalate tension in Ukraine. As President Obama has said, we will judge Russia by its actions, not by its words. The U.S. and Europe have imposed repeated rounds of sanctions to increase the cost Russia pays for its choices. And as you quoted, Mr. Chairman, we are ready to impose more costs, including targeted sector-specific sanctions, very soon if Russia does not decisively change course and break its support for separatists. As Russia's economy teeters on the brink of recession, in part from the cost of its intervention in Ukraine and the impact of our sanctions, as noted in the latest IMF report released a week ago, Russians need to ask themselves what their government's policy has really delivered for them or for the people of Ukraine, other than economic hardship, violence, kidnapping, and death. Today in Slavyansk, in Kramatorsk, and in other towns recently retaken by Ukrainian forces from the separatists, the Ukrainian government is delivering humanitarian aid and restoring services. They are also working to restore the Ukrainian people's faith in their government's ability to provide a better future. Ukraine's success or failure in its struggle for peace, reconciliation, and human dignity will impact the future of the entire region, and with it, the prospect for achieving America's 20-year objective of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. We therefore continue to have profound national interests in supporting the people of Ukraine in their quest for a more stable, democratic, and prosperous future. And in this effort, we deeply appreciate Congress's continued bipartisan support. We look forward to your questions.
Secretary Glaser.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Corker, and distinguished members of this committee for inviting me to speak to you again about the administration's response to Russia's occupation and purported annexation of Crimea and its continued provocative actions elsewhere in eastern Ukraine. In my remarks today, I will discuss our continuing efforts to impose additional costs on those who seek to destabilize eastern Ukraine and maintain the occupation of Crimea. I'll describe the impact that our actions have had on those targeted, as well as on the already faltering Russian economy. I will also discuss the support we and the international community have provided to Ukraine for its economic recovery. President Obama has issued 3 executive orders granting Treasury authority to target those responsible for ongoing unrest in eastern Ukraine. We have now issued 5 rounds of designations under those executive orders, responding to the actions of Russia and Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine, designating a total of 52 individuals and 19 entities, including 4 banks. In so doing, we have sought to have the greatest impact on those whose actions have threatened the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, mainly separatist leaders, members of Putin's inner circle and the entities that support them, and Russian government officials. Our actions have been complemented by designations announced by other countries, including the EU, Canada, and Australia. Most recently, on June 20th, Treasury designated 7 individuals who attempted to establish illegal governments in eastern Ukraine or assisted in arming separatist groups. The United States is working with Ukrainian authorities to identify and disrupt financing to those and other separatists. As President Obama has stated repeatedly, the United States remains prepared to impose additional sanctions should circumstances warrant. Currently, we are developing a number of options in the event Russia does not take immediate steps towards de-escalation, including actions involving a broad range of sectors. Of course, such preparation involves close consultation with our partners and to maximize the impact on the Russian economy. In the past 2 weeks alone, I have personally traveled to France, Germany, and the UK to advance preparations. As Secretary Liu has said, if the moment comes when we need to take additional steps, we will be prepared to do so. Our measures and the threat of future measures have exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities of a Russian economy weakened by years of mismanagement. IMF growth projections have been downgraded twice this year and currently are close to zero. The uncertainty created by the combination of Russia's conduct in Ukraine and the ongoing threat of sanctions has led to challenges for Russia's economic outlook, its most prominent companies, and its economic policymakers. President Putin himself has said that Western sanctions imposed on Russia have had real impact on domestic businesses, including limiting access to funding for many Russian companies. As recently as this week, Russian Deputy Finance Minister Sergei Storchak conceded that Western sanctions are having a significant impact on the Russian economy. He went on to say that, quote, "The effect of sanctions has intensified because of the imposition of sanctions coincided with the fall in the growth rate of the Russian economy." Indeed, we have witnessed more than $50 billion in capital flight this year, and the IMF and the Russian Central Bank project that net outflows will reach $100 billion for the full year. Increased risk premiums have caused a spike in borrowing costs, shutting many Russian companies out of external debt markets. While Russian politicians project confidence in the face of sanctions, their government's actions show otherwise. The Russian Central Bank has raised key interest rates twice this year and spent approximately $30 billion in foreign exchange reserves since March to stabilize the ruble amid heavy capital outflows in the first quarter. Despite these interventions, the Russian ruble has depreciated by 5% since the beginning of the year. President Putin admitted last month that the government of Russia may need to intervene with budget funds to support Russia's banks. As a result of sanctions, the Russian government has openly discussed diverting government funds to support Russian industry. Recently, President Putin stated that Russia needs to look into recapitalizing Gazprom by the amount it would cost to build infrastructure in the Far East. Taken as a whole, these measures indicate that the Russian government is focused on short-term crisis fighting and that its actions are costing Russia the investment needed to reverse long-term downward economic trends. In addition to our measures to isolate the Russian economy, the United States government is working with the international community to support the Ukrainian government in returning the country's economy to solid footing. We are working with the IMF, World Bank, and others to ensure that Ukraine has the support it needs over the coming months, as I outline in greater detail in my written testimony. By combining our efforts to impose financial costs on those threatening peace and security in Ukraine with measures to encourage Ukrainian economic recovery, the United States government is working to contribute to the development of a strong, unified, and prosperous Ukraine. Furthermore, we are prepared to take additional strong measures to impose severe costs on Russia in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Chairman Menendez, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Secretary Chollet.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Corker, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and how the Department of Defense is working to help Ukraine address its security needs. We remain deeply concerned by the security situation in Ukraine's east, where the Russian military remains very active in facilitating the movement of forces, equipment, and finances across the border. Additionally, Russian irregular forces and Russian-backed local separatists remain active inside eastern Ukraine, and both are supported by Russian financing. These actions are not consistent with Russia's pledge to stabilize the situation and seek a negotiated outcome. It is in our interest to have a Ukraine that is stable and secure. Across the spectrum, Ukrainian leaders have made clear that they want our help, and we are committed to assisting them, which is a message that President Obama, Vice President Biden, Secretaries Kerry and Hagel have made clear in their meetings with their Ukrainian counterparts in the past month. On security, we are working to support Ukraine along 3 lines of effort. First, we will continue to support Ukraine's urgent supply needs. President Obama has approved $33 million in security assistance for Ukraine since the beginning of the crisis. This is an order of magnitude beyond our assistance in previous years to Ukraine and more than 4 times what we provided Ukraine last year. This assistance has started to flow. We've delivered 2,000 sets of body armor, first aid kits, tactical radios, and 5,000 uniforms. Soon we'll send night vision devices, thermal imagers, EOD robots, Kevlar helmets, and additional radios. We are actively pursuing additional sources of assistance, which we will apply to Ukraine's most pressing needs. Second, beyond the immediate supply needs, the Ukrainian military needs support through enhanced training and exercises. As President Obama made clear after his meeting with President Poroshenko last month, we are discussing additional steps to help train and professionalize Ukraine's military. To aid this effort, U.S. European Command has established a senior steering committee with Ukrainian counterparts to identify areas where we can improve our bilateral military cooperation, conduct assessments, and identify requirements we can address through training and development. And those meetings are underway in Kiev this week. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we will work with Ukraine on reforming and, in some cases, rebuilding its defense institutions. While I was in Kiev last month meeting with Ukrainian defense and national security officials, the Ukrainian defense minister said that the biggest obstacle to reform is the military mindset still largely oriented toward the old Soviet way of doing things, and he requested our assistance in reform and improving military education. To do so, U.S. defense advisors will help the Ukrainians develop a feasible and sustainable reform program. To get this started, a 5-member initial scoping team visited Kiev a few weeks ago and met with various Ukrainian defense and security officials. Additionally, embedded U.S. civilian advisors in the Ukrainian Defense Ministry can help the government build a national security strategy that provides a cohesive vision for the Ukrainian military, border guards, National Guard, and other security institutions. Another area of needed reform will be in the defense industry. Ukraine is endowed with an advanced defense industrial base that employs more than 40,000 people, which is in danger of collapse due to the current reliance on the Russian market. Given Russia's aggressive actions in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and elsewhere, the Ukrainian government has understandably stopped all military sales to Russia. To reverse the downward trend in the Ukrainian defense industry, U.S. advisors can help the Ukrainians develop long-term investment plans to enable them to attract other markets, develop long-term investment plans, and shift away from reliance on Russia. Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, the U.S. cannot achieve success in these 3 areas of security assistance by itself. We need others to join us. For example, NATO allies who have experienced their own challenging defense reforms over the past decade, such as Poland and the Baltic states, can provide abundant expertise on similar reforms in Ukraine. And we need other NATO allies to step up and help Ukraine's security forces to continue to reform and modernize and professionalize over the medium to long term. We will also continue to rely on the leadership from Congress, especially in supporting the European Reassurance Initiative, which President Obama announced on his trip to Europe last month. If approved, this initiative of $1 billion will help the U.S. military to increase its defense presence in Europe and would cover enhanced training, readiness, exercises, and facility improvements in Europe to reassure our allies. The initiative would also bolster our material assistance to key partners such as Ukraine. So I look forward to working with this committee and the Congress as a whole as we seek your approval on this important effort. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you all. Let me start with you, Secretary Nuland. A month ago, President Obama and the G7 promised more economic sanctions if Putin didn't stop inciting violence in eastern Ukraine, in a pattern that seems increasingly familiar to all of us. Putin made gestures that suggested the appearance of Russian withdrawal while engaging in other actions, such as having tanks cross the border, overseeing the cutoff to gas supplies that are hostile by anyone's standard. And then reading from your own testimony, Russia has made too many commitments at the diplomatic table over the past 4 months that have been rendered hollow by the weapons, cash, and fighters that continue to flow across the border to fuel the fight in eastern Ukraine. And that element was also echoed by Secretary Chollet. So I look at what the standards were, which was calling on Russia to end all support for separatists, to control the border, to help establish an effective OSCE monitoring regime, to use its influence with separatists to return the 3 border checkpoints to Ukrainian authorities, to release the hostages they hold, to launch substantial negotiations on the implementation of President Poroshenko's peace plan. And I see no advance in any of those standards. So what are we waiting for?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I certainly don't disagree with your assessment that we have not seen progress on any of the areas that I outlined, or indeed that the G7 outlined or that the EU Council outlined. As I said, when President Poroshenko came into office, he came in with his broad and deep peace plan and was committed to testing it. His first aspiration was to test it in concert with separatists. So he first wanted to try to negotiate a ceasefire that was bilateral. When, after a couple of weeks of effort, that failed, he decided to initiate his ceasefire unilaterally. And that was a test that he asked the U.S. and Europe to support, to see whether separatists would meet him halfway, to see whether, in fact, Russia would meet him halfway after the meeting at Normandy brokered by Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande, between President Putin and President Poroshenko. As you have noted, and as I noted in my testimony, that ceasefire came and went, and in the process, Ukraine lost territory to separatists, it lost border control posts, and the weapons continued to flow. The Europeans continue to try to bring the sides together to see if a ceasefire can be reestablished. They have failed over the last week to do that because separatists have refused to meet in any location that is safe. So we are continuing to consult with our European allies. The President, the Secretary, all of us have been in constant day-by-day discussion with the Europeans to assess, and I think our analysis is the same, that we have not seen progress. So in that context, we are continuing to prepare the next round of sanctions. As we have said repeatedly, and as the President has said, these sanctions will be more effective, they will be stronger if the U.S. and Europe work together. And we are working on those in the context of...
I appreciate your answer, and I've let you go to try to make it as substantive as possible, but it begs the question, what are we waiting for? I understand all of that. I understand that President Poroshenko tried to give this. I think the Ukrainian government has bent over backwards to try to get to a peaceful resolution, to get the Russians to ultimately go along. But all the Russians call for is ceasefires, and then they take advantage of it, and they do nothing in return. What is this about a Ukrainian fighter pilot turning up in Russian jails? How does Russia justify having a Ukrainian armed force member acquired by separatists ending up in a Russian jail? How is that an example of trying to resolve the problem?
Well, thank you for citing that case, which is clearly a violation of international law and human rights. This is a Ukrainian service member who was taken hostage on the battlefield by separatists about a month ago, and she's now turned up, as you said, in a Russian prison, clearly making obvious that link between Russia and separatists. Senator, we are continuing the conversation with the Europeans about the right moment for sanctions as they prepare for the last meeting of European heads before the summer break, which is on July 16th.
So if perchance on July 16th the European Union heads don't come to a conclusion and move forward on sanctions, which is only about less than a week away or so, then will we have the summer lapse, and Putin will know that there's no consequences, and the United States will stay on the sidelines waiting for the Europeans? Is that something that we could actually expect?
Chairman, as I said, our goal is to act in concert with Europe, but the President has always made clear that if necessary, he will act on our own.
Let me ask you this. We see the Russians creating a succession of oil deliveries and gas deliveries on the Ukraine, and I would love to hear what that looks like going into the fall if it continues, which will be not too far in the distance. We have American companies helping Russia learn how to drill offshore in the Arctic and exploit their shale resources. Now, I don't think we should necessarily create a Russian shale revolution and thereby strengthen Russia's energy weapon, which they have shown clearly that they are willing to use, and threaten others in Europe to do. Where's the administration on that issue?
Chairman, we have made clear to U.S. business the risks of continuing to provide high-tech investment in the current climate. We have also, in the context of our sanctions work internally and with the Europeans, focused intensively on what we might do in the next round with regard to high technology investment. You are not wrong that Russia depends on outside investment in order to take its energy exports to the next level. And
you know, Russia is basically an extracting country. It doesn't create too much more. And that's just the biggest driver of its economy. It seems to me that if the Russians have shown themselves willing to use energy as a weapon, which they have, Ukraine is a perfect example of it, but even the European reticence is in large part about energy questions, then at the end of the day, why would the United States, in its national interests and national security interests, allow entities to ultimately help the Russians further develop their energy resources so that then they would have more energy to be able to use as a weapon? Is anybody thinking about that?
We are thinking about that, Chairman. This is in the category of a set of measures one could take that would only be effective in terms of the goal that you seek if they were done in concert with Europe. Because while the U.S. has this technology, so do some key European companies as well, and we would not want to be in a situation of denying our companies and having Europeans backfill, so we are having a conversation with Europe about it.
I doubt that there is anyone in the world as advanced as the United States on the specific technologies as it relates to shale exploration. And so, you know, it seems to me that we fight with, you know, one hand behind our back, maybe two, with a leader who has no limitations from what I can gather, other than when he is faced with an equivalent countervailing force that is either military, and we're not talking about in this case, or economic. And so, you know, I don't get it. And I don't know how much longer there are going to be those of us willing to wait before we act independently. Senator Corker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And your questions really are similar to the kind of questions I want to pursue. And Secretary Nuland, I know that you do a good job of staying in touch with us, and I appreciate that. And yet, seriously, I sometimes wonder whether Foreign Service officers feel like resigning when you're put out there to continue to sort of sound tough but know that nothing's really going to happen. I'm just curious if you could, to the degree you can, knowing that you're serving in the State Department and have responsibilities, what really is happening here with the sanctions? I mean, the fact is, you know, everything we said we were going to put sanctions in place for relative to Russian actions has occurred, every single thing. They have never responded to the threats, the hollow threats that we put out there. What is it really that, what's really driving our sort of feckless sanctions policy right now? Is it the internal debate in the administration between the economic folks who are so worried about the elections this fall they don't want to do anything that might blow back on us economically, and the security folks who are concerned about that very bitter peace that we're basically establishing right now with Russia? Is that what's driving it, or is it the fact that we know Europe is never going to come to the table? And what is keeping us from doing some of the things that the chairman has mentioned that I've talked to you about on the phone? What's keeping us from going ahead and putting sanctions in place when we know that there's Russian military equipment on the ground in eastern Ukraine? Y'all know that. You've said it publicly. They're funding separatists. What else is it that we need to see happen and know happen before we actually put biting sanctions in place?
Well, first of all, Chairman, just to say it is my great honor to serve in this position at this very vital moment. First,
I know it has
before
to be very frustrating, though, to continue to wake up in the mornings and look in the mirror and practice talking tough, but know that nothing's going to happen. I really respect your service. I just love for you to share with me why nothing is happening.
First, Ranking Member Corker, I think it is important to go back and look at the last few months and take some appropriate look at what might have happened had we not had the rounds of sanctions that we have had.
I don't want to hear that. I read the papers and I talk to you. I want to know, tell me what the rub is within the administration that is keeping it continuing to sort of lay out red lines and make threats but not act, continuing to undermine our credibility, continuing to move towards this bitter peace I alluded to. Tell me what is keeping us from taking action today. Military equipment on the ground. We know they're funding separatists. We know they're playing this duplicitous game of escalation, de-escalation. Why aren't we acting?
Again, as I said, with regard to this next round, it was the desire first of President Poroshenko to test his peace plan. He has now done that. We are quite clear that we have not seen the results that we are seeking from Russia, so we are now talking to the Europeans about when it is appropriate to move together. As I said,
when is it appropriate?
As I said, their last heads meeting of the summer is next week. It's on July 16th. And they very much, and we very much prefer to move together.
Yeah.
So we are looking at the evidence and we are building the package as we move forward.
You remember you told me the last meeting that was the last meeting we were going to have was at the end of June, and that's when we were going to take action. And I know that everybody on this panel has to be incredibly frustrated. Again, I just wish that you would explain to me what it is internally so we can understand the dynamic within the White House, within the administration, that is keeping us from going ahead and putting sanctions in place when we know exactly what is happening.
I think the primary desire at the moment is to stay tightly coordinated with Europe as we move forward, because the sanctions will be stronger if we move together. But, Chairman, if I might for a minute just remind that there was a moment where we had 40,000 Russian troops ringing the border. We threatened sanctions and those troops moved back.
That is absolutely untrue. That is absolutely untrue. They stayed on the border weeks and weeks and weeks afterward, and they kept saying they were moving away, and our NATO friends kept saying they're not moving away. That is absolutely not true, what you just said.
There was a moment when we had 40,000 combat units ready to move. A lot of them moved back, but you're not wrong that we have a significant number returned. There was a time when we thought we wouldn't have an election in Ukraine, and it was the solidarity between the U.S. and Europe, including the threat of sanctions, that helped preserve the space for those elections. So we have, when we work together with Europe, been able to provide time and space for Ukraine to recover. We need to the extent that we can, continue to work with Europe, because that'll make this policy as effective as possible.
I'm embarrassed for us. And I just wish the administration would quit saying publicly, through you and others, the things that are being said when we know that we're not going to act. We don't act. Secretary Glaser, you talk about the damage we've done to the economy. I just had someone look, and maybe we read the chart wrong, and I just looked at it briefly, and I apologize for not having done it an hour or so ago, but the Russian stock market's up 22% since March. And whenever I talk to the people at the White House, they tell me how damaging this has been to the Russian economy, and I keep citing stats that point to something very, very different. Am I correct that the Russian stock market is up 22% since March? Am I reading the chart wrong?
The Russian stock market is up. I don't know if that's the exact right number, but I'm sure that's correct.
Okay.
But
Just out of curiosity, I mean, I know there are a few oligarchs, quote, 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 that probably are having some unpleasant travel experiences and maybe having some assets frozen, but how is this affecting Putin's calculation when the economy is booming? Because I guess people around the world realize that that our threats are hollow, that we're never going to do anything. Germany sees itself as a bridge between us and Russia. Chairman and I were at a dinner one night where that was clearly pointed out. They're not going to take action. So how can you say that the sanctions that we've put in place already have had any effect whatsoever on Russian behavior?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Senator. I don't think that short-term gains in the Russian stock market counterbalance the long-term real damage that we have done and are continuing to do to the Russian economy. That's been recognized by the Russian government, as I noted in my testimony. It's recognized by foreign investors, as demonstrated by the fact that Russian businesses, Russian banks are having a hard time raising capital in international capital markets. It's recognized by the Russian people themselves, as reflected by the $50 billion in capital flight we've seen already, estimated to be at $100 billion by the end of the year. So that's the Russian government, the Russian people, and international investors who all recognize that the Russian economy has been severely damaged, both by Russian mismanagement and by our sanctions and threat of future sanctions. So I do think that we could point to real impact that we've had. Now, I think it's a fair question. At what point does this start to impact Russian strategic calculations? And you're absolutely correct. I do think that at this point, as Toria said, we have had some deterrent impact on Russia, particularly in terms of tactics. But it's clear to all of us that as a broad strategic matter, their strategy remains the same. And that's why, as Toria said, we're working so hard internally and working so hard with our friends and partners in Europe and in the G7 to make sure that when the time comes, we have a very strong package of measures. And I'm quite confident that at that time we will have a strong package of measures and it will do severe damage to the Russian economy.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. I just want to close by saying that, again, I respect each of your service to our country. I know that each of you have to be somewhat disappointed in the actions that have not been taken. And Secretary Chollet, I mean, $33 million in assistance to the Ukrainian military, I mean, I think that's nice. We still haven't done the things that they've really asked us to do. And I would just say to Secretary Glaser, the credibility, the damage you're talking about to the Russian economy, we'll see. I think our country acting like such a paper tiger to the world on this and so many other fronts is doing incredible long-term damage to our nation. And I do hope at some point the administration will actually follow through on the things that it continues to tout publicly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Secretary Chollet, there were a number of reports over the weekend about successes of the Ukrainian military, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how substantive we think those successes were, what we attribute those to, and what response we're seeing out of Russia.
Thanks, Senator. You're absolutely right. There have been, over the last 4 or 5 days, some significant successes by the Ukrainian military in the east. A major city, Slavyansk, was liberated and is in control now of the Ukrainians. There are still several other key cities that are now largely surrounded by the Ukrainian military. And we're watching that situation very closely. I think there's probably not one single answer to why we've seen the tide turn, at least for the moment, and I want to stress that this isn't over yet. So although the trend line is good for now, we need to watch this very closely. It could be that the ceasefire period allowed the Ukrainian military to regroup, orient itself. As you've seen, President Poroshenko has been very active in the planning and the leadership of this. He was just yesterday dressed in military fatigues in the field, talking to his troops and his generals. But also, I think you can see that although there is a significant Russian presence on the border, that has been reduced. We are still seeing weapons appear on one side of the border and then mysteriously appear on the other side of the border that are clearly Russian origin. So I think it's a combination of a little bit of a lessening of support by Russia, but then also an opportunity for the Ukrainians to regroup after this very quickly cascading crisis over the previous months. The ceasefire, I think, helped.
Well, again, if I could ask you to answer on what do we think, why do we think Russia has pulled back somewhat, and what do we think their continued response will be if the Ukrainian military continues to be successful?
So on why Russia's pulled back, I do think the sanctions have helped. I think this was, they did have an effect, and they certainly changed Putin's calculation on how much support he would be willing to give and how deep he would get into this. The Ukrainians have also been able to improve their border security. They have said that their border is sealed along the east. That has been a very porous border. When I was there a month ago and was briefed by the head of the border security, it was described how in many cases it's not even demarcated, the border between Ukraine and Russia. So I think that's helped. I think we have to be very mindful of what the Russian response could be, and that's why we're watching this so closely. It's a very dangerous situation, and of course the Ukrainians need to be vigilant themselves in how they handle the situation in terms of civilian casualties in the surrounding of these cities, and they have stressed to us that they are going to be very careful about how they handle this situation. But I think we have to really expect the worst in terms of a Russian response, and that's why we're watching it so closely.
Secretary Nuland, can I ask you to respond to that too? Assuming that the Ukrainians continue to be successful in throwing the rebels out of the cities that they're holding and actually forcing them, many of whom are Russian, back into Russia, what do we think Putin's response will be? And are we concerned that their success means that Russia will be more aggressive in coming into eastern Ukraine?
Again, Senator, I think it depends on how Putin ultimately calculates his interests. He has other ways to create pressure and destabilization on Ukraine, including the energy card and the economic card. But our hope would be that as the Ukrainians, as Assistant Secretary Chollet said, harden the border and make it more difficult to covertly support the separatists, that the choices become more stark for Russia, at least on the military side. Another factor that I think has contributed to the Ukrainian success is that in the towns that separatists have held, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk before they were liberated, human rights abuses, looting, abuse of the civilian population have gravely turned those in the East who may have had affinity towards Russia, who may have had affinity towards the separatist agenda at the beginning, firmly against them. And the Ukrainian military has benefited from improved intelligence from the population that wants these guys gone. So it's a matter of the Ukrainians continuing to deploy careful, judicious tactics to make a success and restore good livelihood in places like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk that are free, and make them an example in Donetsk, but also continuing to raise the cost of military intervention by raising that border, by making it clear that in the international community we will sanction against more military, more transfers of heavy metal and those kinds of things.
And are we seeing Poroshenko being willing to address corruption within the country, and what kinds of concrete steps has he taken and has he committed to take?
The government just last week published its 3-year anti-corruption plan and its 6-month action plan. As you know, Senators, they've already started to put a legislative base in place through the RADA. That was part of the IMF conditionality. There is more legislative base required as part of their association with the European Union. The key focuses of the 6-month action plan are preventing conflict of interest for public servants, strengthening punishment for corruption, judicial reform, going after some of the most corrupt folks in the system, e-governance, creating transparency, those kinds of things. And we are committing significant U.S. assistance to help in the anti-corruption effort, as is the European Union. But we'll have to judge them by how they implement. It's a very difficult, pernicious problem throughout society, as you know.
And is that an agenda that's helpful as they're taking back cities in eastern Ukraine to be able to show very specific actions, and are they willing to do that, and do they have support from local officials in those communities?
It was the #1 plank on which President Poroshenko ran for office: anti-corruption, clean government, clean Ukraine, Europe, and peace. Those were his 3 platforms. So they've now got to prove it on all sides. In eastern Ukraine, the #1 concern is economic opportunity and the fact that it's been essentially a Rust Belt heavy industry economy. So as the Ukrainian government takes back parts of eastern Ukraine, they're reaching out to us, they're reaching out to the European Union, asking for support for micro-projects and other things that will quickly jumpstart the economy, and over the longer term, diversification of that economy away from heavy industry and extractive and into things that will bring innovation and technology and opportunity to the Donbass.
My time is up. Thank you. I would suggest that energy efficiency, as they're looking at projects, is one great opportunity that they should take advantage of.
Senator Flake.
Thank you. Secretary Nuland, I think we're all buoyed by what we've heard in the last couple of weeks, particularly the military successes and how we attribute that. I think we're all surprised that the Ukrainian military is showing more strength than they seem to have before. But also, I think a lot of it is the fact that the elections were good, went well. The government has legitimacy. People have some hope in the East, at least. With regard to further action by the Russians and their calculations and our own sanctions, I couldn't agree more that sanctions are more effective. I've always felt in other areas of the world as well, when they're multilateral, not unilateral. And it's far more effective if we work hand in glove with Europe. Say the same situation that we have today, roughly, persists. That Russia kind of plays this game. Maybe the Ukrainian military is successful on and off, taking another city or pushing back a little. Do you, I just want your honest assessment of where Europe is here. Will they move forward imposing tougher sanctions if we have anything approximating the status quo in Ukraine?
It is my judgment, based on hours and hours and hours of consultation with Europeans and trips across some 20 of the 28 European Union countries, that if Russia does not stop rearming separatists, does not stop its financial support, that we will have European support for another round of sanctions. It may not be completely parallel to everything that we want to do, but this is a process moving forward. There is no one in Europe who thinks that what is happening in eastern Ukraine is in the EU's interests or Europe's interests, and everybody wants to get back to a place where there are civilized relations between Russia and Ukraine, so we have to make it cost if Putin continues to go down that road.
Can you describe, outside of sanctions, what efforts are being made to push back on Russia's failure to pull back, I should say, further than they have? Aside from sanctions, what efforts is the State Department undertaking?
We've also, working with Europe, put in place an intensive campaign of diplomatic and political and to some extent economic isolation. For example, as you know, the U.S. has ceased virtually all military-to-military cooperation with Russia. We've ceased virtually all economic cooperation at the government level, high technology, all that kind of thing. The Europeans have largely matched that. You'll recall that we downgraded the G8 back to a G7 and had it in Brussels without the Russians. None of us, with the exception of Normandy and a couple of other things, have been welcoming senior-level Russians in our capitals. We have been restricting the work we do together to those things that are clearly in our global shared interest.
Mr. Chollet, The Ukrainian military benefits from, I guess it's the Partners for Peace program with NATO. Can you describe that? How is that helping them prepare and grow and have the capabilities that they need?
Absolutely. It has helped them over 20 years that they have been a NATO partner, and they've operated with U.S. and NATO forces in places like Kosovo and Iraq and Afghanistan still today. And so there's no doubt that their partnership with NATO has helped them in the course of this crisis. The fact that they were a partner with NATO has helped us diplomatically and militarily in terms of supporting Ukraine in various meetings in Brussels of both Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel around the NATO-Ukraine Council. So there's a lot of support that they get, and there is practical help that they get. And NATO, in addition to U.S. bilateral efforts, NATO is also seeking ways to continue to help Ukraine reform and further professionalize its military.
Is the Ukrainian military and the government satisfied with our efforts to bolster the military there?
In my talks a month ago with the then Ukrainian defense minister, we have a new defense minister, but as well as the national security advisor, we talked a lot about the support that they were looking for, and some of which is support that has been delivered since my visit, particularly in the body armor, which they were very focused on. There are other items that are on the way. We've pledged to do, we can pay for, things like night vision, and border security is something that they are very, very focused on. They have a very long list of asks, as you've probably seen, and part of the point of the discussions that I've had, the Secretary Hagel's had, that our European command team is having today in Kiev, is to talk with them in more detail about further needs that they have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This isn't the Cold War. The world just doesn't revolve around who's with the United States and who's with Russia any longer. There are paradigms that matter a lot more to us than that, but it has similarities in the sense that this is a long-term engagement in which we are creating a contrast with Russia for the countries that lie along the fault line between East and West. And what matters most, really, is the work that we do over years and decades to rebuild the economic and military capacity of those countries so that they really do truly have a choice. And I join with Senator Corker in lacking envy for the position that you're in, but for different reasons. I think we want to be careful not to be too responsive in the short run so as to pollute the efforts that we need to make in coordination with the Europeans to win the long-term game here. I mean, the Russians used to be the best at playing the long game, and that's how they expelled Napoleon from Russian territory. Today, they're all about short-term return. We now have the advantage, hopefully, of seeing the long game here. I want to, though, Secretary Nuland, challenge a little bit of your optimism about where Europe is heading. I agree with Senator Flake that we've got to do this to the extent possible in coordination with Europe, but they seem to be moving backwards in some ways. I mean, the French are arming the Russians. There's about a half dozen EU countries now that are considering building the South Stream pipeline, even though it contravenes the third energy package directives out of the EU. I just think that further complicates your work. It is more reason why I am not envious of the position you're in, because I think that you're working with a continent in which they fundamentally disagree as to what kind of existential threat Russian aggression presents them. We tell them that they have to be serious about this, and they turn around and have a very different view. So am I wrong to think that in some ways Europe is moving in the wrong direction rather than, in your estimation, kind of holding a neutral position pending new developments?
Senators, as you know, because you've traveled to a very large number of the countries under my responsibility, there are lots of different views and lots of different situations within Europe in terms of their historic structural dependency on Russia. What we're trying to do in the conversation is make the point that you've made, that everything's connected to everything, that what we offer is a democratic free market model, and that is what we need to support in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia. On things like South Stream, you made a good impact when you were in Bulgaria, and that was very important for U.S. diplomacy. I would, though, give a shout out also to the EU, which has suspended support for South Stream until it can further evaluate the larger dependency impact of that project. And we are working intensively with the European Union on the larger issue and with the nation states of energy diversification, giving them other options, interconnectors, LNG, other sources of energy to reduce their dependence. It's a major line of effort of what we are involved with. So I think it's an issue of continuing to talk to the Europeans about our larger strategic interest of creating less dependency on countries that are autocratic and countries that use trade as a weapon and countries that use energy as a weapon, and more of a vibrant market set of principles within Europe.
So my default is to do this in concert with the Europeans, but when we were in Bulgaria, we did see the effect of unilateral U.S. sanctions. We sanctioned a Russian individual, Timchenko, who was potentially going to be connected to the construction of the South Stream pipeline into Bulgaria. Not exactly sure why Bulgaria decided to halt construction, but there's a lot of speculation that part of it was that they were worried about the consequences of doing business with an individual that was sanctioned unilaterally by the United States. So maybe the question to you, Mr. Glaser, as you sort of think about the impact of unilateral sanctions, there certainly seems to be some evidence that if the Europeans aren't willing to move with this, that there is some impact when the United States acts alone.
Absolutely, Mr. Senator. And as Assistant Secretary Nuland said, President Obama has repeatedly emphasized that we will be prepared to act alone if we need to act alone. And you're right, the United States plays a pivotal role in the international economy. We play a pivotal role in the international financial system. And that does give us power, and it gives us leverage, and it's leverage that we have been using, as you point out, Mr. Senator, in the case of Russia, frankly, through many of our sanctions programs across a wide range of issues. We repeatedly shown that when we act alone, we can act in a meaningful way, and we can have real consequences, as I tried to outline in my testimony. All that said, as you point out, it is obviously the case that we will be more effective and more powerful, both politically and as a practical matter, if we move forward with the European Union, if we move forward with the G7. So I do think that the time spent trying to put all that together is time well spent.
And listen, by the way, we have a lot of other irons in the fire when it comes to the work that the State Department is doing with Europe, some that actually matter more to U.S. national security interests than Ukraine does, for instance, the Iranian nuclear negotiations. We had a great hearing yesterday, Secretary Nuland, on European energy security, and thank you for sending your deputy to join us. Last question for you. There was some dispute amongst our second panel as to who benefits and who is hurt by a continued dispute over gas supply from Russia into Ukraine through to Europe. Some think that that will ultimately hurt Ukraine because they will be seen as having to make a choice between their own citizens and passing along the gas to Europe. Others thought that maybe that would move Europe more quickly to energy independence if they continue to see the downside of reliance on transit through Ukraine. What's your guess on who stands to lose the most from a prolonged dispute over gas transit through Ukraine?
I would say in the short run, both Russia and Ukraine lose because they don't have other options than to deal with each other. And Ukraine, as you know, makes valuable revenue by being a transit country. Over time, Ukraine obviously has to focus more effort, and that's part of the assistance that we're providing on diversifying, including diversifying as a transit hub. Doesn't just have to be a transit hub for Russia. It can also, through reverse flow, be a transit hub into other countries from Europe if we can energize the market. But obviously the best outcome will be if, with the European Union's help, and European Commissioner Oettinger, as you know, is trying to midwife negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, if they can come to an agreement on a fair European market price in stable conditions for the next year, year and a half, and demonstrate to the world that they are both reliable in this regard. But As you know, Russia has not been willing as yet to guarantee a year-long price to Ukraine.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I know you have a difficult job. I wanted to, Secretary Nuland, focus on a bill that has been filed in the Senate that Senator Corker's taken the lead on. It's called the Russian Aggression Prevention Act of 2014, and I was still hopeful that we can get the administration's support. Let me give you the thinking behind it. First, I'm going to describe kind of how I view the situation. I would love to have your input on it. But it seems to me that what Putin is playing here is a very careful game. His ultimate goal, of course, and I don't think you would disagree with this, is he wants to coerce Ukraine and Kiev into an agreement that guarantees Russian influence over Ukraine's foreign policy. So they have a two-pronged plan to do this. On the one hand, they provide support for separatists. In fact, I've seen just in the last 48 hours open-source reporting of evidence that they're making significant transfers, again, of heavy weapons to separatists in eastern Ukraine, such as tanks and armored combat vehicles, and there's signs that they intend to do more of that. At the same time, they're also keeping alive the threat of military intervention. They've already created, in their minds, the rhetorical groundwork for that sort of intervention for humanitarian reasons that they've made up. But there are now also open-source indications that they're beginning to redeploy military units along the northeastern Ukrainian border for the first time since the May withdrawal of forces, and that includes armored vehicles, artillery, air defense units. And my sense is that given the recent offensive gains made by Kiev, the threat of military intervention will rise again. The flip side of it is they play this very careful game of this public role that they now have of calling for a ceasefire, so they can appear like they're the mediators and Kiev is the aggressor. So up until now, they've actually, I think, quite frankly, played that game fairly well. For example, when Putin asked that the force of authorization, the use of force authorization be lifted, immediately thereafter, the EU foreign ministers decided not to impose additional sanctions. And by the way, I think this is part of a broader strategy that they have of dividing or cutting into Western unity on the idea of new sanctions. But I also think, and this is my guess here, but I would be curious to your input on it, that there's probably some serious divisions in Moscow about the way forward. On the one hand, you've got these hardliners, of which Putin may be one of them, that want to see a tougher stance, and you probably have the separatists themselves feeling like as much as Moscow's done, it should be more. On the other hand, you probably have a bunch of elitists in the government in Russia that worry about the broader implication of more sanctions. One example, especially in the energy sector, is that Asia is going to soon overtake Europe as Russia's leading export market, especially after this latest deal. But they're going to really struggle, I believe, to meet their demands and the commitments that they've made. Sanctions have made it harder for them to access foreign financing and Western technology. For example, one of the ways they plan to meet their commitments to China is in this eastern Siberia fields that they intend to use. But this field's going to be harder to develop than most others because they have high levels of deposits of helium and so forth. It's similar to a challenge they're already facing off the coast of, I think it's am I pronouncing it right, the Sakhalin Islands, where they're having struggle. I think they're 10 years off base in terms of doing that. And China, by the way, knows this. I don't know, obviously haven't shown me the deal, but I bet you that in the deal that they've done with China, the Bank of China has probably reserved the right to revoke lines of credit if Russian companies can't access credit or can't access technology because of broader Western sanctions. So if we know this is the game that they're playing, and we know this is the balance they're going through in deciding what to do next, why wouldn't we just put in place now, through legislation, very specific consequences for what will happen if, in fact, they move forward? In essence, why don't we, instead of leaving it an open question of what might happen via the U.S. if Russia moves forward with military intervention or continues to arm these separatists, why not just put specifically in writing what that will be, including specifically, as I outlined, the access to advanced U.S. oil and gas technologies, so that as they're having this debate in Moscow, they don't have to guess or can have conjecture about what it would mean, but they will know for a fact what it would mean if they continue. And I believe this would also have an impact on China and other Asian countries who are trying to cut deals or figure out how to access more Russian energy. Why not just put that in place in writing now so that it is clear what the consequences will be for them to continue on the course they're on?
Senator, thank you for that. Let me say that we have been absolutely clear in our diplomatic conversation and quite specific, including at the level of the President and his conversations with President Putin, about the kinds of additional sanctions that we are considering, including in the high technology area. As I said before you came in, We are also working intensively with Europe on these kinds of measures because it is not just not just American companies that have this technology that Russia needs, so do European companies. So if we move in the direction of those kinds of sanctions, they will be stronger and more effective and non-punitive vis-a-vis our companies if we do it together with Europe. So it's very much on the docket. It's very much in the conversation with Russians and with the European Union as the kind of thing that we are looking at moving forward.
So your answer has two aspects to it. The first is if we go on our own, if we do this by ourselves, it may undermine the Western unity that we seek in terms of other countries in the region that also have similar technologies they could provide.
Yeah, if on the one hand, if we deny U.S. companies the opportunity to invest, but European companies continue to invest, then we not only have an ineffective sanction, we have...
No, I understand.
Yeah.
If that's what happens, it would
Right.
be ineffective. But is there a concern that if we act alone, if we just put this in legislation alone without working with them, that it would somehow make them less likely to join us in that endeavor?
Senator, as I've made clear to the chairman and the ranking member, I think as an administration we are open to working with you on a bipartisan piece of legislation in this regard, but we need to make sure that if we go in this direction, that whatever we put forward we can implement, that it doesn't disadvantage U.S. companies vis-a-vis others, that it will be effective.
What do you mean
on Russia.
disadvantage U.S. companies?
As I said, that if we
Because that sounds like you're saying, well, we don't want to sell you technology, but if other people are selling you technology, then we might as well make some money on it too.
No, my point is that if we were to move forward with some kind of work together on bipartisan sanctions legislation, we would want to make sure that whatever we had in that bill, we could implement together with Europe, and or we would not put ourselves in the position of hurting the American economy without hurting the Russian economy.
Well, I guess I would just close by saying that my view on it, and I hope I can convince others of this as well, is that when the U.S. is specific, if we specifically put out there in legislation, of course it would have to be bipartisan to pass in the Senate, if we specifically make clear this is what will happen if you continue to do this or if you do this, then it's no longer just Secretary Kerry, on the 26th of June saying you should disarm separatists or else. It's actually in place and will happen. And I think that sort of American leadership will, in fact, bring us closer to the kind of unity we seek from our allies. So I truly hope that this is the direction that we'll head, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. One of the events in 2013 that was a precipitator of the massive street protests was Yanukovych's unwillingness to sign the EU association agreements, both the political and economic agreements. We haven't yet gotten into this. In March, the political association agreement, I guess, was signed, and then in June, the economic association agreement was signed between the new Ukrainian government and the EU, which suggests both some EU cooperation and the effect of this election in continuing the Ukrainian path toward greater associations with the EU. What is the significance of the signing of those association agreements, both for Ukraine, and what has the reaction been in Russia to those signatures after they were balked at in the end of 2013?
Overwhelming support, needless to say, in Ukraine. It was one of the major tenets that President Poroshenko ran on and that made him a popular and overwhelming candidate. Europe has offered Ukraine through these agreements not only the potential for visa-free travel for all of its citizens, but also virtually tariff-free entry for its products to the European market and the other way. So it's a real economic, political, and people-to-people boost. It will require a good amount of hard work to prepare implementation. The Russians, throughout this process, expressed some concern that because they have tariff-free trade with Ukraine now, that there would be unintended impacts on their economic situation. They pushed very hard for consultations on the implementation of the agreement, and the European Union and Ukraine have now agreed to those. And I think tomorrow, at the level of trade minister, there will be trilateral discussions among the EU, Ukraine, and Russia on how to implement the agreement in a way that has least market disruption across the region and potentially might benefit Russia as well, so that it might begin to see this in less zero-sum terms.
right at about the same time as the June agreement was being signed with the EU. Shortly thereafter, NATO met and announced that no new nations were going to be coming into NATO, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, anytime soon. And in particular about Ukraine, what has the reaction been in the Ukraine to this? Was that sort of understood among all parties that this is a time where we move toward further European integration on the economic and political front? However, we kind of put NATO aside for now. Is that sort of, generally understood by the Ukrainians? Or did they object to that decision?
Senator, both in his election campaign and since, President Poroshenko has made clear that for his administration, the question of closer integration between Ukraine and NATO is not on the table. So it hasn't been a demand of the Ukrainian side, and the alliance respects that. As you know, this has to be a matter of choice for all nations.
I want to associate myself with some of the comments made both by the chairman and Senator Rubio on, I think, the virtues of more exploration of energy and technology-related sanctions, and I look forward to continuing those discussions. But it is important for us as we weigh sanctions, and particularly if we might have to do sanctions unilaterally, if we consider doing them ahead of Europe, that does have effects on American companies. The last time we had a hearing on this matter here, I hypothesized, naively, not knowing anything, what a potential economic effect of financial sanctions could be on U.S. credit card companies, that especially the big two, that govern about 90% of current credit card transactions in Russia. And after just blithely hypothesizing it, I got a call the next day from one of the American companies saying that actually, as a result of the sanctions that have been done thus far, the Russian government is now pursuing the creation of its own credit card infrastructure and putting laws in place that will really punish and hurt the business of the two major American-based credit card companies. And I was wondering, Assistant Secretary Glaser, if you could talk about that a little bit, because unilateral sanctions from our side do pose some significant risks if they're not done carefully.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Mr. Senator. I would say that some of the retaliatory or countermeasures that Russia takes to protect itself from sanctions really are just examples of Russia imposing sanctions on itself.
Yeah.
It's examples of Russia pulling itself out of the international financial system, isolating itself from the international economy, which is the exact opposite of what Russia needs to be doing in order to address its fundamental economic difficulties. That said, we are aware that the actions we take could have impact on American business and American companies, and it's something we take quite seriously. I think American businesses and American companies understand what's at stake, and they understand that it's not business as usual with respect to Russia. And they understand what we're trying to accomplish in terms of the future of Ukraine and the future of Europe and the future of the international community. So they understand these are important matters. And I think, as always, we're prepared to move forward if we need to. But again, it should go without saying, but I think it bears repeating. It's always going to be more effective, both politically, practically, and in terms of fairness to American companies if we can move forward multilaterally, which again is why I think it's time well spent and effort well spent to try to achieve that.
Let me just make sure, do I have my facts right on this? Because I was just hypothesizing last time. I understand that the U.S. financial sanctions have led Russia to do legal reforms that would essentially make it near impossible for Visa and MasterCard, which now cover 90% of credit card transactions in Russia. The effect of our sanctions has been for Russia to move forward with legal measures that will make it virtually impossible for Visa and MasterCard to operate in that country. Am I right about that?
Well, one of the things that Russia has done as a result of this overall situation, certainly to include U.S. sanctions, U.S. unilateral sanctions that we've imposed, has been to move forward on ideas that frankly have been circulating within Russia for quite some time in terms of a variety of measures that would require credit card companies or other types of financial entities to locate within Russia. And yes, that would create serious problems for companies like Visa and MasterCard.
I was watching the interaction between Senator Corker and Secretary Nuland on this, and the Senator was asking a very appropriate question. Why is it hard to do these things? I don't think the answer is that hard. I mean, I think unilateral sanctions without the EU could have some effect on Russia, but it also has very significant effects on us. And then if it opens up opportunities for European businesses to take the business that we're doing, then we at least have to grapple with that kind of cost-benefit equation in moving forward. The best sanctions are ones where we're together with the EU. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do unilateral sanctions, but the ones we've done already have not only affected the European economy, but they've already had a pretty significant effect on some fairly important American businesses, and we just have to balance that out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. 2 weeks ago, I, along with some of my colleagues on this committee, sent a letter to the President urging him to make energy security the centerpiece of our engagement with the new leadership in the Ukraine. This is urgent, and I am concerned that there are two threats that may be more powerful than Russian troops when it comes to the challenges facing the new Ukrainian government, and they are both related to energy. First, Russia has shut off the natural gas spigots to Ukraine. That's half of Ukraine's supply, gone. When winter arrives and natural gas demand spikes, this could become a crisis. Second, Ukraine has begun eliminating their energy subsidies. Energy subsidies provided by the Ukrainian government are massive, amounting to 8% of the country's entire GDP. The $17 billion loan package approved by the IMF to stabilize the Ukrainian economy includes requirements that Ukraine gradually eliminate these subsidies. As a result, retail natural gas rates in Ukraine will rise by 56% this year, another 40% next year, and another 20% in 2016 and 2017. That's a potential new source of instability. Ukraine's subsidies do make energy markets opaque, inefficient, and susceptible to corruption, but they're also extremely popular. They keep energy affordable for many households. Now we're talking about a brand new government coming in and ushering in a doubling of energy prices. This is, of course, music to Putin's ears. He wants nothing more than a Ukrainian population distrustful of their government and looking for alternatives. Ukraine needs an Apollo project-like effort to become more energy efficient and increase production within their borders in order to get off of Russian gas. And like the Apollo project, failure is not an option in this area either. There is a narrow window of time to help this new government consolidate support and give Ukrainians a credible bulwark against Russia. So, Ambassador, are you concerned about the reaction from middle and low-income people in Ukraine when their energy bills skyrocket 56% right after the new government takes control?
Well, Senator, thank you for your commitment to this issue in Ukraine. It is also a priority of the Ukrainian government, and it's a priority of the assistance efforts that we have going with the Ukrainians. As you know, I think these price hikes in energy were part of the IMF requirement for Ukraine to get healthy, which is why when we came to the Congress to ask you for the $1 billion for the loan guarantee, we earmark, in coordination with the Ukrainian government, the vast majority of it to help insulate the most vulnerable in the Ukrainian population from these kinds of adjustments, particularly in household energy prices. So we've already made a huge down payment there. When you get our congressional notification that I make reference to in my testimony for the remaining $59 million we have this year for assistance, you'll see a large chunk for the whole complex of energy issues, from energy efficiency to restructuring the sector to diversification. You yourself have said in previous hearings accurately that Ukraine wastes a third of its energy out the windows and in other inefficient ways. But we are also working aggressively with European allies and partners on reverse flow. We've had good success in beginning reverse flow gas into Ukraine from Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary. We're going to continue those efforts in coordination with the European Commission.
35 Ukrainian mayors sent a letter urgently requesting assistance in increasing the energy efficiency of their buildings and district heating systems. We're talking about inefficient Soviet-era boilers, buildings without thermostats, uninsulated steam pipes, really the lowest of low-hanging fruit, all right there, with these mayors begging for help. Are you finding an appetite within the new Ukraine to move rapidly and to have additional U.S. assistance to help with this project? Because ultimately we need to have some kind of goals that the government is establishing. And perhaps you could give us some sense of what you believe is a reasonable goal for the Ukrainians to reach in terms of increased energy efficiency, perhaps over the next 2 years, over the next 5 years, et cetera.
Senator, we'll get you the Energy Department's assessment of how quickly they can move, but they are making this a priority. As you know, they have to change the tax base, they have to change the incentive structure for Ukrainian industry in particular to reform. Interestingly, in the conversations we've had with the Ukrainian government about the challenges of revitalizing Ukraine's east and recovering if they can bring peace and security back, one of their focuses is on energy efficiency and recapturing revenue that is lost in these Rust Belt industries. So let me just do a shout out to one of the requests that we've made of the Congress, which is to be able to use funding from the Western New Independent States Enterprise Fund for micro projects in the East, some of them targeted specifically at retooling old factories. So
okay, well, I think
that
that's an excellent request, but I'd like to see enhanced, increased attention to this area, because obviously with a 56% increase in natural gas prices coming up this winter, and with 35 mayors writing about their old Soviet-style buildings and boilers, there's a big appetite right now to make a quick change, and I just think that we have to front burner this issue to help them to move very, very quickly, because again, that is what will keep Putin and Gazprom sleepless at night, if they do believe that they're responding to their mayors who realize the bills which are going to be run up. And so, again, I urge you to have a program of that nature and to set real goals. I think there has to be real goals that are set in this energy sector. Same thing is true, by the way, for natural gas. I think if we are going to be helping them with new technologies, and we should have a telescope time frame that we create then for a doubling of natural gas production inside of Ukraine. And we should set those goals, set benchmarks, and then let's meet them, because that is the real threat to Ukraine from Russia. And once we do that, I think that country will feel a lot better about its ability to be able to cope with this threat that is almost primarily energy-related. And so I think perhaps by the next time we have a hearing on this subject, Mr. Chairman, if we could have the concrete goals that are being set, especially for this winter, and the message that are being sent to the Ukrainian people, that'll counter the propaganda that's going to come in from Putin as to the suffering that he will say is unnecessarily being inflicted by the Ukrainian government on his own people. I just think we need a counter message that's very concrete and not vague. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciate your ideas. I think we will take them and try to move them forward here in the committee. Let me just say I appreciate the thoughtful remarks of Senator Murphy and Senator Kane. And as we close this panel, because I want to go to our distinguished panel before the 12 o'clock vote that's coming up next, you know, I understand that there are no ever simple or great choices in these matters. But time is on Putin's side. And I say that because he certainly believes he can wait out the United States and the European Union and maintain enough instability in the Ukraine to damage its economy, to frustrate its public, as in the context of energy, as Senator Markey just talked about, and to undermine the government's political cohesion. In short, Putin doesn't have to win today. He only needs to generate a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine that he can exploit when the world has moved on. And that has been a standard operating procedure for years, and Russia has used it in Georgia. They used it in Moldova, where Russian troops continue to occupy territory and back separatists. And by giving the world the appearance of responsibility and reasonability, by asking the Parliament to withdraw the law authorizing the use of military force in the Ukraine, Putin successfully gave those who wished to avoid the G7 sectoral sanctions at the end of June ammunition to argue against action at the time. So we've seen this movie before, and he has been successful in it. And I would just hope, as I said to Chancellor Merkel when we had the opportunity to have dinner with her, as I've said to others who have come to visit with us from the European Union and to our own government, that if we've seen this movie before, we know how it plays out, we should be able not to have the movie repeat itself with the same ending. And that's really my concern here. I do not see us at this point in time where we're headed, changing the course of events in a way that this won't play out, and nobody even talks about Crimea anymore. Thank you all for your testimony. We look forward to continuing to engage with you on this issue. Call up our next panel. We have two very distinguished former national security advisors. Stephen Hadley, the former National Security Advisor to President Bush and now a principal at Rice, Hadley, and Gates, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, counselor and trustee at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the author of countless books giving us the benefit of his profound insight into world history and world affairs. We're incredibly pleased to welcome both of these gentlemen back to the committee. We look forward to your testimony. I would, if I could have my friends in the press so that I can see our witnesses, thank you. We welcome you back to the committee. We'd remind you that your full statements will be included in the record. As you can see, members have a lot of questions on these issues, like to take advantage of your expertise, and we'll want to have time for that, especially since there's a 12 o'clock vote. With that, Dr. Brzezinski, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Hadley, and then we'll get to questions. Just push the button there. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senators, since I know your time is very limited, I don't think I'm going to read to you my statement, even though it is actually fairly short. I'll merely summarize the 3 key points that I try to make in it. I acknowledge the fact that what Putin tried to do 3 months ago in regards to Crimea is not the same thing as he's trying to do in regards to Ukraine as a whole. Nonetheless, at the time, it generated enormous enthusiasm in Russia, and in fact, a session of the Russian parliament at which he presided on March 18th was really like a jamboree on the subject of chauvinism, Russia's world role, the unity of all Russian speakers around the world, and the role of Russia as a global civilization. Since then, I think realism has begun to intrude more directly, namely that Ukraine will not fall quickly, that Ukraine is not resigned to being simply a member of a renamed version of the Soviet Union or of the Tsarist Empire, and that there is a rising will in Ukraine to deal with the legacies of wasted 20 years of Ukrainian independence, and that major reforms are necessary, but also acts of will designed to show Ukrainian determination to be an independent nation. This is the context, and I think Putin has to realize by now that he has to think of alternative choices. I outlined them more fully in my statement, but the first is, of course, some sort of an accommodation with the West. And I try to outline in my statement what might be the principal features of such an accommodation. One which doesn't meet the maximum objectives of those in the West who would like to see Ukraine a member of the European Union, but also of NATO. But it certainly doesn't meet also the maximum objectives of Russia, which would like to see Ukraine subordinated to Moscow in the context of the so-called Eurasian Union. There are other specifics that would have to be considered, but that, in a sense, strikes me as a possible framework for an accommodation. Failing that, Putin has the option of continuing more directly to destabilize Ukraine. He has done this recently. That hasn't worked that well. He could attempt it on a larger scale. But if he does, I rather expect, from what one knows of the attitude specifically of Chancellor Merkel and of President Hollande of France on this subject, that acts of a more overt and drastic type on a larger scale to destabilize Ukraine would precipitate the kinds of sanctions that had been planned and which the United States would like to see implemented sooner rather than later. And that remains a bone of contention in the alliance, but they're there. And the initial sanctions have sent at least ominous signals to the Russians not to take these issues lightly. The third alternative, of course, is a complete showdown militarily on the model, perhaps, of Crimea, but overlooking the reality that all of Ukraine is far more complicated than a relatively small peninsula, the object of a sudden and unexpected attack. I think it's quite clear that if there were to be a larger Russian intervention, the Ukrainians would resist on a protracted basis, and especially the risk of urban warfare for taking Ukraine over would entail the necessity of occupying the large cities. Ultimately, Kiev itself is something that no Russian leader can contemplate lightly. It could become protracted, bloody, very costly, and the result would be a disaster both for Ukraine and for Russia. Both would be basket cases as a consequence of anything of this sort. So the choices that Mr. Putin has to make are not easy, but they're there, and they reflect the fact that I think it is becoming increasingly clear to him that he should not confuse a brief triumph in which he exulted a few months ago in Crimea with the larger dilemma of Ukraine and the longer-range relationship of Russia to the global community. As it is, and I'll end on this, Russia's international position has deteriorated. It is certainly no longer a serious partner with the United States. There are more and more questions about Russia's role in the world, in Europe, and insofar as China is concerned, it is increasingly evident that if there is any relationship between Russia and China that has any degree of depth to it, it is an asymmetrical relationship in which China by far is the senior partner that can insist on terms favorable to it, as was the case in the recent energy agreement with Russia. And Russia is a junior partner, geographically, culturally, and demographically, culturally, and border-wise vulnerable to Chinese pressure. So I think that's where I'll stop. The statement goes into these issues at greater length. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Brzezinski. Mr. Hadley.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I've got a statement which I've submitted that talks about what Putin is up to, how far he's like to press his current actions, what should be our objectives and strategy for dealing with it. I'll just leave that for the record. The bottom line I try to make is that we have seen in the past that Putin's objectives escalate as he succeeds, and he's not meet with resistance or counter pressure. And therefore, I think it is important that we be putting together the elements of a strategy that will put in that counter pressure. I thought what I might do with my time is try to answer some of the questions that you have raised in the first session and give you my answers to them for what it's worth. Why is the administration so...
Mr. Hadley, could you just take that microphone and put it closer to you?
Yes, sir. Sorry.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
So why is the... thank you, Mr. Chairman. Why is the administration reluctant on sanctions? I think it is partly, one, they want to have unity with the Europeans because they do not want to let Putin drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, and I think that's right. Second, I think it's an effectiveness point. If you look at foreign direct investment, 75% of foreign direct investment in Russia comes from the EU. The United States only has about $10 billion a year. We're 10th in terms of foreign investor. If you look at trading relations, we're the 12th export partner, the 5th import partner of Russia. So we don't have the economic clout. And if you really want to be effective, you want to have the Europeans along, because that's where the investment and the trading relations are. Third, I think they're reluctant because sometimes sanctions are more effective in the anticipation than they are in the execution. So I think that explains the reluctance. I think, though, as I say in the statement, we've telegraphed this punch so often without delivering it, I think it raises a question of credibility. And therefore, I think, Mr. Chairman, in response to your point, if the Europeans don't act on July 16th, I think we're going to be forced to go ahead unilaterally. But I would hope we would do it in the following way. Having worked with Chancellor Merkel, who has the lead on this within Europe, with an understanding that we will go first and she will do her best so that the Europeans will follow. Similarly, the legislation, Senator Rubio, that you talked about, that Senator Corker, I think, is sponsoring, a kind of a roadmap of what will happen if Putin persists in this activity, I think that can be a very useful tool. But I would hope it would not only have bipartisan support within the Congress, but it is something we would have worked with the Europeans so that it in fact becomes a roadmap for what we and the Europeans will do together if Russia and Putin persist. That doesn't mean that it has to be unilaterally or multilateral at the time it's adopted. What we would hope is many times we have to lead the Europeans by taking action, but with an understanding that hopefully in the end of the day we will end up on the same page. Last 2 points. And one, I think, I saw Dr. Brzezinski's article in the Post this morning, and I thought it was a very good statement. I only have one small quibble with it, which answers one of the questions Senator Kane answered. We ought to be strengthening Ukraine's capacity to defend itself and to other states that are at risk from pressure from Russia. The issue of NATO enlargement is not on the table. The Ukrainians have not asked. For them to join NATO would be a long process, years in the future. So it is not on the table, but I would also not explicitly take it off the table and say that the door is closed to Ukraine, because I would not like to reward Putin for his pressure. And I think we need to stick to the principle that countries should be free to select the alliances they choose, free of coercion, pressure, or the use of force. Finally, last point, as I say in my statement, while I think there are elements of policy that we need to put in place that are probably even more important for sanctions than sanctions over the long term, I think we want to do it in a way that does not close the door on Russia, does not say to Ukraine that if you come west, you have to sever your historical and economic ties with Russia. I don't think that is smart. I think we need to leave the door open for a Russia that will change its policies and come back to the post-Cold War consensus and want to move west. And I think we should do that to keep faith with those people in Russia that hope for a more democratic and more Western-oriented future for their country. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.